I never thought a piece of paper could tear my family apart. But when I found out my stepmother had sold my grandfather's ranch, I realized that greed doesn't wait for permission. The original deed had my name on it, the legal proof that I was the rightful heir. Yet somehow she acted like I didn't exist. I remember standing in the dust of the driveway, the wind whipping through the fields my grandfather had tended for decades, feeling a mixture of anger, disbelief, and helplessness. I'm Madison Harper, and this is the story of how I fought to reclaim what was mine, and how the truth eventually came out, even when everyone else wanted me silenced. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I grew up in the rolling hills of Montana, where my grandfather, Henry Whitaker, had built a life from scratch. The Whitaker Ranch wasn't just land, it was a legacy of sweat, early mornings, and stubborn pride. Grandpa Henry had always been a fair man, though strict, and he loved his family fiercely. After my mother passed away when I was 10, he became my anchor, teaching me everything from horse riding to managing livestock, even showing me how to handle business negotiations when I was old enough. Those years on the ranch shaped me, instilling a work ethic and resilience that I never truly appreciated until it was threatened. The ranch was meant to pass down to me legally when I turned 25. My grandfather had ensured that by putting the deed in my name years before. I had been patient, respecting his wish that I learn first before I claimed it. I had no idea that patience would be tested so soon, and in a way I could never have anticipated. Everything changed when my father remarried after Mom's passing. His new wife, Evelyn Parson, seemed sweet at first, a polished, city-bred woman who smiled too easily and had a habit of adjusting her diamond ring when she thought no one was watching. I was cautious, but I tried to give her a chance for my father's sake. For a while, she played the part well, helping with holiday dinners, showing interest in the ranch, and even pretending to learn the names of the horses. But there were cracks in her behavior that I ignored, chalking them up to someone trying to fit in with a family whose roots were deeper than hers. It wasn't long before I started noticing the little manipulations. Quiet conversations with my father when she thought I wasn't around, subtle dismissals when I asked questions about family finances, and a strange eagerness to sell things I had always assumed were untouchable. I was 24 when the first real warning signs appeared. Grandpa Henry had fallen ill, and while he was hospitalized for a routine procedure, Evelyn started showing an unusual interest in the ranch's paperwork. At first, it seemed innocent, asking questions about taxes, insurance, and land management, but it quickly escalated into something far more sinister. One afternoon, while helping Grandpa sort through old documents, I noticed a folder missing. The original deed to the ranch, the very piece of paper that proved ownership. My stomach dropped. I knew that my grandfather had put that deed safely away years ago in a locked cabinet that only he and I had access to. I asked him casually, trying not to alarm him, but his reply was short and uneasy. "It should be here, Madison. Don't worry about it." He dismissed the thought so quickly that I could tell something was off. A few days later, the shock came. My father received a notice from the county recorder's office. A sale had been finalized on the ranch, and the new owner's name was on the title. Evelyn had sold it, without my grandfather's approval, without even telling him that she had the right to do so. My mind raced. How could she do this? The ranch wasn't hers to sell. I confronted her immediately, my hands trembling as I held the notice, my voice sharp with disbelief. "I don't deserve this," I said, the words trembling out before I could stop them. She smiled, that cold, practiced smile that I'd grown to distrust over the years, and said, "The law doesn't care who deserves what, Madison. You weren't running this place. Your father and I had to make decisions." I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach out and shake her until she acknowledged the truth that this was not her decision to make.
At that moment, I realized the fight ahead of me was not just about the land. It was about every principle my grandfather had stood for and every lesson he had taught me about fairness, honesty, and perseverance. I spent nights poring over old paperwork, photographs, and letters, trying to trace exactly how she had managed to sell what wasn't hers. It became painfully clear that Evelyn had taken advantage of my grandfather's illness, his trust, and my father's blind compliance. My father, a gentleman who had always avoided conflict, refused to confront her. He seemed paralyzed, caught between loyalty to his new wife and love for his father and me. That inaction fueled my anger even further. I realized that if I didn't act, the ranch would be gone forever, erased from our family's history as though it had never mattered.
In the weeks that followed, I began to plan carefully. I reached out to a local attorney, someone who specialized in property law and family disputes, explaining everything in detail: the original deed in my name, the unauthorized sale, and the timeline of deception. We discussed evidence, witnesses, and the possibility of halting the transaction. While the legal side was crucial, I also knew I needed the emotional backing of my grandfather, who was still weak from his procedure, but mentally sharp. Sitting beside him in his small, sunlit hospital room, I took his hand and told him everything I had discovered. His eyes, usually full of mischief and warmth, were clouded with a mix of pain and disbelief. "I can't believe she would do this," he whispered. "But Madison, you have to fight. You have to finish what I started." That moment lit a fire in me I had never felt before. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was purpose. I was determined to reclaim the ranch, not just for myself, but to honor my grandfather's legacy and the values he had instilled in me. Even before the sale, the cracks in our family life had been growing, subtle but persistent, like fissures running through rock that eventually split under pressure. I began noticing the ways Evelyn maneuvered herself into control, not just over the ranch, but over my father's attention and loyalty. She had a way of twisting casual comments into accusations, making him doubt his own judgment, and in turn, questioning his instincts about me. My father, Tom Harper, had always been easygoing, more concerned with keeping the peace than confronting conflict, and Evelyn knew it. She thrived in that space, where charm and manipulation masked ambition, and no one dared challenge her without being labeled confrontational or irrational. It was exhausting, and it made me feel increasingly isolated, like the person who had grown up in the very land she now tried to erase was somehow invisible. The ranch had been a world unto itself, a place where I had felt safe, where my grandfather's teachings still echoed in the wind through the pastures. After the sale, I walked its fences alone, the early morning mist clinging to my boots, the smell of hay and soil sharp in my nostrils. Every corner of the property carried a memory. The barn where Grandpa taught me to saddle horses, the old oak where he had carved our initials decades ago, the pond where we had spent endless summer afternoons fishing and dreaming. Each memory felt stolen, as though the very land had been turned against me. I realized that the fight wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal. The ranch wasn't a commodity. It was the sum of decades of hard work, love, and family identity, and Evelyn's actions threatened to rewrite that history. I started paying closer attention to her interactions, the way she spoke to the ranch hands, the way she moved through rooms with a sense of entitlement that had no grounding in reality. She would redirect questions about chores or livestock finances toward me, claiming it was because she trusted me to handle it. But the tone carried a subtle jab, a reminder that she had the power to decide who mattered and who didn't. I noticed how she would listen for snippets of conversation and twist them into support for her own agenda, always careful to frame herself as rational and concerned, while everyone else seemed petty or unreasonable. It was the same tactic she used when negotiating the sale, playing the part of a concerned caretaker while quietly orchestrating the transaction behind our backs.
Her manipulations weren't loud or obvious. They were slow and insidious, the kind that erodes trust and confidence before you even realize it.
Meanwhile, my father's detachment worsened. He would nod politely when I expressed concerns about Evelyn's behavior, but there was a tension in his eyes, a silent apology that he wasn't willing or able to fight with her. It wasn't that he didn't care about the ranch or Grandpa's legacy. It was that he feared confrontation and the fallout from challenging Evelyn directly. I began feeling a responsibility I hadn't anticipated. If my father wouldn't act, then I had to. Every day, I went through the motions of helping him with ranch business, answering questions about inventory, scheduling repairs, even negotiating with contractors, all while quietly documenting everything Evelyn did. I realized I needed proof, not just anecdotal evidence, but concrete documentation showing her manipulations, decisions, and eventual overreach. The deed, of course, was the central piece, but it became clear that the surrounding evidence would be just as important to prove intent and protect my claim. As the days passed, I also started talking to people who had known my grandfather longer than any of us had been alive. Neighbors, longtime ranch employees, and friends of the family who had seen the ranch grow from a handful of fields into the sprawling property it had become. Their stories gave me context, but also revealed the quiet tension that had existed under the surface for years. They had always liked Evelyn superficially. She was polite, articulate, always neatly dressed, but many admitted privately that she seemed different around decisions involving the ranch. Some had noticed small inconsistencies in her explanations about property management or finances, but they hadn't wanted to interfere in what seemed like a private family matter. That knowledge helped me realize that I wasn't alone in my doubts. There were witnesses, people whose observations could later support the truth I knew needed to emerge.
At home, tension had become almost unbearable. Every meal was a careful dance, a negotiation in which words had to be measured so as not to provoke Evelyn's temper or coax my father into retreating further. I noticed how she would subtly reposition herself at the table, ensuring that her hand rested on documents or devices, signaling control even in mundane moments. My grandfather's hospitalization meant that she had free rein in the house, which she wielded quietly but effectively. She started reorganizing paperwork, claiming it was to help with tax season, but I had learned enough to know that nothing she touched could be trusted. I began taking mental and physical notes, photographing documents where allowed, and keeping copies of correspondence. The more I watched, the more I understood that this was not a one-off act of greed. It was a calculated effort to seize control and consolidate power over the family's legacy, and I couldn't allow it to succeed. Despite the constant pressure, there were moments of clarity and resolve. Sitting alone in the study late at night, the ranch sprawled silently outside the window, I would go over the old lessons Grandpa Henry had imparted, the importance of diligence, patience, and courage. He had told me that standing up for what's right often required discomfort, even confrontation, but that in the end, integrity had its own reward. I clung to those memories like a lifeline, knowing that if I lost my focus now, I would lose more than just property. I would lose the connection to the man who had shaped my life. Each page I examined, each witness I spoke to, each careful observation of Evelyn's behavior reinforced my determination. I realized that winning back the ranch wouldn't be easy. It would require strategy, courage, and a willingness to expose uncomfortable truths. But it had to be done, and I knew that my grandfather and my own sense of justice depended on it. By the end of that month, I had a clearer picture of the hidden problem. Evelyn had overstepped her boundaries in ways no one outside the family had noticed yet, and my father's hesitation had given her the confidence to act. The stakes were high, the opposition subtle but formidable, and the outcome uncertain. Yet, despite the tension, a spark of purpose had ignited inside me. I wasn't going to let the legacy my grandfather had built be erased by deception and greed. I would fight, quietly first, but with everything I had. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning that seemed ordinary at first, but turned into the kind of day that changes everything. I had driven out to the ranch before dawn, hoping to check on the cattle and make a list of repairs that needed attention while my grandfather recovered in the hospital. The sky was gray, clouds heavy with the threat of a storm, and the gravel driveway was slick beneath my boots. When I reached a barn, I noticed a moving truck parked where the old equipment shed used to be, its lights off but engine still warm. My stomach tightened. I knew immediately that Evelyn had been at it again. This wasn't just paperwork or subtle manipulation anymore. This was action. Inside the barn, I found two men loading antique farm machinery into the truck. The tractors, the hand tools that had been passed down for generations, even Grandpa Henry's old blacksmith forge were being hauled away as if they were no more significant than discarded furniture. I called out, my voice sharp and trembling with anger. "What are you doing? These don't belong to you!" One of the men looked up, startled, and Evelyn stepped out from behind a stack of crates, her coat slick with rain, her smile calm and calculated. "Madison, darling, relax," she said, her voice soft, almost patronizing. "Everything here is being relocated. It's for efficiency. Your father agreed it was time to modernize things." My hands shook as I realized the depth of her audacity. My father may have nodded along in private, but he hadn't given anyone the authority to liquidate the ranch's history while I was still actively involved in its care. I felt a wave of helplessness at first, the kind that comes when you realize that logic and reason won't stop someone determined to manipulate the truth. But then, buried beneath the shock, anger surged. I stepped closer, holding my phone in one hand, ready to document everything, and said firmly, "These aren't yours to move. Grandpa's property, the tools, the land itself, this is part of my inheritance. You can't do this." Evelyn's smile never wavered. "Madison," she said gently, "you need to understand that inheritance isn't always about what's on paper. Sometimes it's about who's willing to make the tough decisions." The implication was clear. She thought she was entitled, that she had the right to make these decisions because my father wouldn't oppose her and she believed I wouldn't fight.
I could feel the storm building outside, matching the one inside me. Everything I had worked for, everything Grandpa had built, was being stripped away in front of me, and the law hadn't even been invoked yet. I remembered the attorney I had spoken to weeks ago, going over the deed, the witnesses, and the steps needed to halt any unauthorized sales. My heart raced as I realized it was time to put all of that into motion. I dialed the lawyer while keeping my eyes on Evelyn and the men loading the truck. The conversation was tense and rapid. I explained the situation, the unauthorized removal of property, and her history of manipulating the paperwork. The lawyer's voice was calm but firm. "Madison, this is serious. Document everything, take photographs, and don't confront them physically. We can get an injunction immediately to stop the removal, but you need proof that she acted without authority." With the phone pressed to my ear, I began snapping pictures of each item being loaded into the truck. The antique plow, the barn tools, even a handmade saddle that had been in the family for decades. Evelyn tried to interfere, her hands reaching for my phone, her voice rising slightly. "Madison, don't be dramatic. You're making a scene." But I refused to back down, documenting every moment, every word. I could feel my adrenaline mixing with fear, anger, and determination. I realized that for the first time, I was truly standing up not just for property, but for principle. The principle that my family's legacy, built over generations, couldn't be erased by someone who cared more about control than history. By mid-morning, the lawyer had filed the injunction, and a representative from the county was on the way to the ranch to assess the situation. Evelyn, seeing her plan unraveling, shifted tactics. She began pleading, cajoling, and even threatening subtly, suggesting that I was being selfish, unreasonable, and disrespectful to my father. She tried to frame the conflict as a personal vendetta, but the mounting evidence I had gathered neutralized her attempts at manipulation. She couldn't argue with the photos, the witnesses who had quietly observed her actions, and the legal documents showing that the property belonged to me. Even as she raised her voice, I felt a strange sense of empowerment.
The realization that I had the tools, the knowledge, and the support to fight back. When the county official arrived, Evelyn's confidence faltered for the first time. The representative looked over the documentation, asked questions, and clearly recognized the legitimacy of my claim. I watched as Evelyn tried to smooth over the situation, offering explanations and excuses, but each one was met with careful, pointed scrutiny. The official finally turned to her and said, "Madison has presented proof that the property is in her name. Any action taken without her consent is unauthorized." I felt my chest tighten with relief, but I also knew this was just the beginning. Evelyn would not go down quietly, and my father's reluctance to confront her fully left room for continued tension and manipulation. By the time the men had returned the machinery to the barn, under the watchful eye of the county representative, and with my documentation in place, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. The breaking point had come not just because of the sale or the property removal, but because the accumulated deception, manipulation, and inaction had reached a stage where something had to give. I had seen the truth, gathered evidence, and taken the first steps to assert my rights. The moment was terrifying, exhausting, and yet liberating. It marked the point where I could no longer remain a bystander. I had been forced into action, and from that point forward, there was no turning back. The storm outside finally broke, rain falling in heavy sheets across the fields and puddling in the muddy tracks left by the truck. I stood on the porch, soaked, staring at the horizon where the ranch stretched endlessly, and felt a fierce determination settle over me. This was no longer just about reclaiming land. It was about defending a legacy, proving my own strength, and ensuring that truth and fairness would prevail, no matter how much deception tried to bury them. In that moment, I understood that the breaking point was also a beginning, the moment where the fight truly began, and I vowed that I would not let anything or anyone take what was rightfully mine. The first plot point arrived with a mixture of tension and vindication, the kind of moment that changes the game entirely. Up until then, everything had been contained within the confines of our family. Arguments behind closed doors, suspicious glances, hushed conversations in empty rooms. But the involvement of an outside party, someone who had no personal attachment, yet had the authority and perspective to see the truth, shifted everything. That person was Rebecca Lang, the county recorder's senior official, a woman known for her meticulous attention to detail and unwavering adherence to the law. She had been called in to verify the claims surrounding the ranch's recent sale, and when she arrived, it felt as though the walls of secrecy that Evelyn had built were starting to crack. I met Rebecca at the ranch office, a small, sunlit building cluttered with ledgers, maps, and legal paperwork. She was professional, but not cold. Her sharp eyes conveyed competence and impartiality. I laid out everything: the original deed in my name, the unauthorized sale notice, the photographs I had taken of the machinery being moved, and the statements from neighbors and longtime employees who had quietly observed Evelyn's manipulations. Rebecca listened carefully, asking questions with a calm but penetrating precision. As I recounted the timeline of events, I could see her making connections that no one in the family had articulated aloud. It wasn't just the sale. It was a pattern of behavior that pointed to deliberate overreach, a systematic attempt to seize control of the ranch. Meanwhile, Evelyn paced the office, her posture rigid, her carefully constructed composure faltering under scrutiny. She tried to interject, offering explanations about modernization and claiming that my father had signed off on everything. Rebecca, without judgment, asked to see the paperwork and cross-checked signatures. One by one, Evelyn's assertions began to crumble. Her evidence was inconsistent, incomplete, and in several cases, outright inaccurate. I could see the realization dawn on her face. She had counted on fear, silence, and my father's passivity to keep her actions unchallenged. And now the truth was being examined by someone who was both neutral and authoritative. This was the first time I truly understood the power of outside validation. Up to that point, my father's hesitation and Evelyn's manipulation had created a psychological barrier, convincing me that perhaps my concerns were exaggerated or misplaced. But Rebecca's objective evaluation changed the dynamic entirely. She didn't rely on emotion, on favoritism, or on relationships. She relied on facts, on documentation, on clear legal precedent. When she finally confirmed that the deed in my name was the controlling legal document and that Evelyn had acted without authority, it was as if a dam had broken. The first plot point, the point of no return, was solidified. There was no way for Evelyn to hide behind manipulation anymore. The evidence spoke for itself, and now it was being witnessed and validated by someone with real power. Even with Rebecca's confirmation, the tension in the room was palpable. Evelyn's smile had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that conveyed both frustration and fear. She knew that her advantage had evaporated, that her actions were no longer shielded by silence or inaction. My father remained silent, still hesitant, but visibly relieved that an impartial authority had intervened. For the first time, I saw a flicker of respect in his eyes, as though he recognized the necessity of my involvement and the legitimacy of my claim. I realized then that while this was a legal turning point, it was also a personal one. The moment when I stepped fully into the role of defender of the ranch, no longer content to observe from the sidelines or wait for others to act. After the meeting, Rebecca advised me on next steps: filing a formal injunction to prevent further sales, documenting every interaction moving forward, and preparing for potential legal challenges from Evelyn. She emphasized the importance of maintaining professionalism and avoiding direct confrontations that could undermine the case. It was a roadmap that felt simultaneously reassuring and daunting. Reassuring because I now had guidance from someone experienced and impartial. Daunting because it underscored the seriousness of the battle ahead. The fight wasn't over. It had only intensified. Walking back across the property that afternoon, I felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The storm clouds that had lingered for weeks seemed to lift slightly, revealing glimpses of blue sky over the rolling hills. The cattle moved slowly through the pastures, oblivious to the human conflict around them, yet their presence grounded me in the reality that this land was still ours, at least in spirit, even if legally contested. I thought about my grandfather, about the lessons he had taught me, lessons of patience, diligence, and courage. I realized that he had prepared me for this, not just to manage the ranch, but to defend it when necessary. In the days that followed, Evelyn became noticeably more cautious. She still attempted subtle maneuvers, redirecting conversations or questioning minor decisions, but she was no longer acting with the reckless confidence she had shown before. I could sense her calculating every move, aware that any misstep would be scrutinized not just by me, but by legal authorities and witnesses who are now fully aware of her actions. The balance of power had shifted. Where once she operated in the shadows, now she was forced into the light, and the truth had an ally in someone with both authority and the capacity to enforce it. By the end of the week, it was clear that the first plot point had irrevocably changed the trajectory of the story. The sale had been halted, the ranch equipment returned, and the first cracks in Evelyn's control had appeared. I felt a cautious optimism, tempered by the knowledge that the opposition was far from neutralized. But for the first time, I truly understood that the outside world could see what I had been trying to prove all along: that the ranch and the legacy it represented belonged to me. I had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The fight for the truth had begun in earnest, and every action from this point forward would be decisive. After the initial validation from Rebecca Lang, I thought perhaps the battle would start to tilt in my favor, but the reality quickly proved otherwise. Evelyn wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and her next moves were calculated, subtle, and insidiously strategic. Almost immediately, I began noticing small attempts to undermine my credibility, both within the family and among the ranch staff who had been loyal to Grandpa Henry for decades. She whispered doubts to the ranch hands, questioning my experience, my judgment, and even my emotional stability. "You don't want to make decisions in anger," she said, in carefully measured tones, implying that my outrage over the sale was irrational. She planted seeds of hesitation and doubt in everyone's minds, attempting to turn allies into hesitant observers. And I realized that winning this fight wouldn't just be about legal proof. It would require gathering indisputable evidence and building an unassailable case, both morally and legally. I devoted every spare hour to collecting and cataloging information. The ranch had thousands of acres, barns, storage sheds, and countless documents, so the task felt overwhelming at times. I began creating a detailed timeline of every action Evelyn had taken since Grandpa Henry fell ill, from her subtle shifts in household finances to her attempts to remove historical items from the property. Every photograph, every email, every receipt was meticulously recorded. I also interviewed longtime ranch employees individually, asking them to recount their observations of her behavior, the changes in routine, and the decisions she had made without consulting me or my grandfather. Their accounts painted a consistent picture of deliberate overreach. While some were hesitant, fearful of conflict or retaliation, their willingness to speak, even privately, reinforced that I wasn't alone. I wasn't imagining her manipulations. The patterns were real, persistent, and deliberate. Evelyn quickly caught on that I had begun gathering evidence. At first, she tried subtle intimidation, standing too close during conversations, questioning why I was taking notes, suggesting that I was being overly meticulous. I refused to let her unnerve me. I realized that controlling my reactions was crucial. If I allowed her to provoke me, I could be framed as unstable, emotional, or unreasonable in any formal proceedings. My lawyer had warned me that tactics like hers were common, designed to make the rightful party appear irrational while the manipulator positioned themselves as rational and responsible. I had to remain precise, calm, and factual. Every encounter with Evelyn became a mental exercise in composure as I learned to record, observe, and document without letting anger dictate my words. Meanwhile, the local community began to take notice of the tension. Neighbors who had once viewed family disagreements as private matters started asking questions. I found support in unexpected places. The postman who had delivered mail to the ranch for decades, a retired ranch hand who had worked alongside Grandpa Henry, even the local feed store owner who had always seen me around the property. Each person I spoke to provided details I hadn't considered, small anecdotes that illustrated Evelyn's pattern of interference, her misrepresentation of facts, and her attempts to isolate me from family decision-making. Slowly, a broader picture emerged, one that went beyond legal documentation and showed a consistent behavioral pattern that could be difficult to dispute. The rising opposition became clearer as Evelyn began involving outside advisors. She brought in a financial consultant, ostensibly to help modernize the ranch, but in reality, his assessments were designed to favor her narrative. He questioned the necessity of certain equipment, minimized the historical and operational importance of items I had cataloged, and subtly suggested that my oversight was unnecessary. I documented each meeting meticulously, recording questions, answers, and discrepancies. It became a chess game, where every move had to be anticipated, every countermeasure carefully planned. I was learning, often painfully, that the fight for truth required both patience and relentless attention to detail. Simultaneously, I had to navigate my father's conflicted stance. Tom Harper wanted peace more than confrontation, yet he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that his wife had acted outside the bounds of legality and ethics. I had to convince him that standing by silently would only embolden her. We had long, difficult conversations in the quiet of the office or the back porch, where I presented evidence, explained the risks of inaction, and appealed to his sense of justice and loyalty to Grandpa Henry's legacy. Gradually, he began to see what I had already understood. Neutrality in the face of deception was complicity. While he remained cautious, he began supporting my efforts in small ways, ensuring certain documents were accessible, quietly advising employees to remain observant, and deferring decisions to me in areas directly impacted by Evelyn's manipulations. The more I gathered, the more the stakes became real. Evelyn's attempts to isolate me, manipulate facts, and gain control over the ranch had escalated to a point where legal action was not just advisable, it was necessary. I realized that this fight wasn't just about reclaiming property, it was about proving the truth to everyone who had witnessed her manipulations, about validating the years of labor and love my grandfather had invested in the ranch, and about reclaiming a sense of agency in a situation that had been systematically stripped away. By the end of the month, I had a comprehensive portfolio of evidence. Photographs of displaced property, recorded testimonies from staff and neighbors, copies of documents and communications, and detailed notes tracking Evelyn's decisions and statements. The tension in the house was palpable. Evelyn sensed that her control was slipping, and though she maintained a veneer of politeness, her subtle intimidation tactics intensified. The ranch staff, once uncertain, now looked to me for direction, and my father had begun to quietly step back, trusting me to manage the unfolding situation. The stage was set for a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. This phase, the rising opposition and the accumulation of evidence, was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. I spent sleepless nights cross-referencing dates, verifying signatures, and preparing statements, all while maintaining daily responsibilities on the ranch. Yet with every piece of evidence, my confidence grew. I knew that when the time came to confront Evelyn formally, I would not just have the law on my side, but a meticulously documented truth that could withstand manipulation, intimidation, and denial. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt that victory was possible, that justice was within reach, and that my grandfather's legacy could be protected. The midpoint arrived like a thunderclap, sudden and impossible to ignore, the kind of revelation that changes everything and leaves no room for denial. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, cataloging documents, interviewing witnesses, and documenting every interaction with Evelyn, but until that day, her denials and manipulations still carried a weight of uncertainty. Then, one late afternoon, a package arrived in the mail, sent by an anonymous neighbor who had overheard Evelyn bragging about the sale of the ranch while thinking no one was listening. Inside the package was a copy of a signed contract, an internal document she had drafted, not authorized by my father, not witnessed by anyone with legal authority, clearly detailing the transfer of the ranch's assets and the methods she used to circumvent my grandfather's original deed. The handwriting was unmistakable, her signature elegant but fraudulent, and the weight of the paper in my hands was heavier than any stone I had ever carried. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pages in disbelief and awe. Every late-night conversation, every subtle manipulation she had tried, every anxious visit I had made to the county office now had context, proof, and clarity. This wasn't just circumstantial anymore, it was undeniable. Evelyn had acted with deliberate intent, forging authorities she did not possess, and attempting to erase both my legal and moral claim to the ranch. I could feel the adrenaline spike as I realized the implications. Not only did I have the leverage to halt her actions permanently, but I also had the moral high ground, backed by concrete evidence that could not be ignored. In court, by the county, or even by our family. This was the turning point where truth became unavoidable. I immediately called my lawyer, explaining the discovery in precise detail, sending scanned copies of the documents for verification. Madison, this is beyond compelling. This is undeniable proof. With this, we can challenge every action she's taken regarding the ranch and demand an immediate reversal. This isn't just a fight, it's a victory waiting to happen as long as we follow procedure and stay strategic. His words ignited a fierce resolve within me. I had expected challenges, delays, and obstacles, but I hadn't fully grasped the power of having a smoking gun, something so clear and indisputable that even Evelyn couldn't spin it into plausibility. That evening, I sat beside my grandfather in his hospital room, the stack of evidence laid carefully on the bedside table. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for them, but his eyes full of warmth and pride met my own. "Madison, you've done something incredible. You've seen through the deceit, collected the truth, and now you hold it in your hands. This is more than a legal win. It's a testament to integrity, and it proves that standing for what is right is never in vain." The weight of his words combined with the tangible proof in front of me created a moment of clarity I would never forget. The truth, once a fragile hope, had transformed into an unstoppable force. The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy sessions, planning with my lawyer and carefully considering the timing of confronting Evelyn. Every step had to be calculated. She was shrewd, experienced at reading people, and skilled at misdirection. If we acted too hastily, she could attempt to destroy or manipulate evidence, or even convince my father to intervene on her behalf. We developed a detailed approach, prioritizing legal filings, securing witnesses, and preparing for possible confrontations. I also began rehearsing the sequence of events in my head, preparing to present the evidence in a clear, unemotional manner that left no room for her to argue or deflect.
The confrontation itself had to be carefully orchestrated. I couldn't simply ambush her in anger. That would give her room to deflect, manipulate, and portray me as irrational. Instead, I waited for a moment when our parents weren't home and when I could control the environment. I invited her to my apartment under the pretense of a casual chat, hoping to create a neutral space where I could present the truth clearly, without interruptions or distractions. When Samantha arrived, she was her usual self, smiling, confident, unaware that the tide was about to turn. I gestured for her to sit on the couch, offering tea as a gesture of civility, though my nerves were coiled like springs. "Samantha," I began, my voice steady despite the racing in my chest. "We need to talk about what's been happening with Michael." Her smile faltered slightly, though she tried to cover it with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, Rachel, I'm sure this is about some misunderstanding, right?" I shook my head, taking a deep breath. "No, it's not a misunderstanding. I know exactly what you've been doing. I know the lies you've told him, the doubts you've planted, the stories you fabricated about my past. And I have proof." Samantha's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping in. "Proof?" she asked, cautiously, a slight tremor in her voice betraying her composed facade. I held up my phone and hit play on the recording. Samantha's smug, confident voice filled the room, recounting her manipulations in painstaking detail. She described how she had twisted my past, warned Michael of supposed patterns in my behavior, and even coached him to question my loyalty. She laughed as she spoke, entirely unaware that her own words were being weaponized against her. Her expression shifted dramatically as the reality of what she had done settled in. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as though she couldn't find a way to defend herself. I calmly laid out the rest of the evidence, screenshots of her texts, the timeline of her interventions, and accounts from friends who had noticed her manipulative behavior. For the first time, I saw Samantha as she truly was, not the confident, untouchable sister I had grown up with, but a person caught in her own web of lies. Her mask had slipped, and there was nowhere for her to hide. She tried to deflect, claiming that she had only wanted to protect Michael, but her words were hollow, unconvincing. The documentation and recording left no room for doubt, no opportunity for her to rewrite history or frame herself as a hero. I felt a surge of clarity and empowerment as I spoke, my voice unwavering. "Samantha, this ends now. You can't interfere in my relationship anymore. You can't manipulate, lie, or poison someone I love. Your actions have consequences, and Michael deserves to see the truth." She recoiled, but it was too late. The proof had already spoken, and her usual tactics, charm, deception, guilt-tripping, were useless against something so concrete. For the first time in our lives, I wasn't the one shrinking under her influence.
I wasn't the passive sister absorbing the damage. I was standing firm, voice raised, evidence in hand, taking a stand that Samantha had never expected. The confrontation lasted for hours, but it wasn't just about anger or blame. It was about setting boundaries, reclaiming control, and making sure that the lies that had almost destroyed my relationship could never take root again. Samantha alternated between denial and defensiveness, but the more she protested, the clearer it became that the recording and documentation had stripped her of power. She had built a house of cards, and it was collapsing right before her eyes. By the end of the evening, she left my apartment in a quiet rage. No words left to challenge the irrefutable evidence I had presented. For the first time, she realized that I could and would stand up for myself, that her manipulations had limits, and that the consequences of her actions were unavoidable. After she left, Michael and I sat together in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. I felt a mix of relief, triumph, and exhaustion. We had survived the most dangerous part of Samantha's interference, the moment where her lies might have been believed without question. And in that moment, I understood the power of speaking the truth decisively, without hesitation, with proof to back it up. It was a turning point, not just for my relationship with Michael, but for my relationship with myself. I realized that I didn't have to live under the shadow of someone else's envy, manipulation, or control. The choice to speak was mine, and with it came a liberation I had never known, a sense of justice, clarity, and the undeniable knowledge that the truth, once revealed, could not be denied. The days following Samantha's exposure were a strange mixture of relief and mounting tension. On one hand, Michael and I had regained a level of trust and understanding that had been eroded by her manipulations, and the knowledge that we had irrefutable proof in our hands provided a sense of security. But on the other hand, Samantha was far from defeated. Her pride, her need for control, and her obsession with dominance over our lives created an undercurrent of tension that could explode at any moment. I knew that confronting her once hadn't fully neutralized her. It had only forced her to recalibrate.
I began speaking slowly, deliberately, recounting the sequence of events that led to this confrontation. I explained the unauthorized sale, the removal of property, her manipulations, and finally, the discovery of the forged contract that had confirmed her intent beyond any doubt. I presented the evidence systematically: photographs, documents, witness statements, and the testimony of those who had seen her actions firsthand. I could see the room shifting as I spoke. My father's face grew stern and focused. The witnesses nodded, and Evelyn's composure began to crack, her lips pressed tightly together, hands fidgeting with the papers she had assumed were under her control. Every word, every piece of proof, pushed the narrative beyond her ability to spin it. As I laid out the undeniable proof, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. Fear because I knew Evelyn would not yield easily, and exhilaration because the truth finally had a voice. She tried to interject, to argue that she had acted with authority, but each claim was met with evidence that nullified it. She shifted, faltered, and for the first time, I saw her as fallible, as exposed. The witnesses, who had once been hesitant, now spoke up, confirming details, recounting observations that directly contradicted her narrative. My father, once silent, finally spoke with authority, stating that he had been misled and that the actions taken without Madison's consent were unacceptable. The culmination of this confrontation was almost surreal. Evelyn, realizing that she could no longer manipulate perception, finally lashed out, not with reason, but with anger and desperation. She accused me of overstepping, of scheming, of turning the family against her. I met each accusation calmly, letting the evidence speak for itself. I understood then that the choice I had made, to confront, to speak, to demand the truth be recognized, was irrevocable. There was no turning back, no retreat. The narrative that Evelyn had tried to control for months was now in my hands, fully exposed and unassailable. By the time the meeting concluded, the room was tense but resolved. Evelyn slumped slightly on her chair, the fight draining from her posture.
while my father, the witnesses, and I absorbed the gravity of what had transpired. The decision to speak had not been easy. It required courage, preparation, and a willingness to risk backlash, but it had changed everything. The point of no return had been reached. I had chosen to act, and the truth, backed by undeniable evidence and witness corroboration, had finally been revealed. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the ranch stretching before me under a sky streaked with crimson and gold, I felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and anticipation. The confrontation had been necessary, the truth undeniable, and yet I knew the battle was far from over. Evelyn would not disappear quietly, and the consequences of speaking out would ripple through the family, the staff, and the community. But for the first time, I felt a deep sense of empowerment. The knowledge that standing for truth, even when it is difficult, is always worth it. The choice had been made, the secret exposed, and the stage was set for the final chapters of this fight for justice. The confrontation with Evelyn escalated quickly after the revelation of the undeniable proof, shifting from tense discussions to direct, overt opposition. She no longer attempted subtle manipulation or whispered doubts. Now she confronted me openly, her voice sharper, her tone edged with threat, and her movements calculated to unsettle. The ranch, which had once felt like a place of security and familiarity, now seemed charged with tension, every creak of the barn door and rustle in the pastures echoing the growing storm of confrontation. I realized that exposing the truth had triggered not just defensive posturing, but active aggression, and I had to be prepared for whatever she might attempt next.
It began in small ways at first. Evelyn would linger near offices, questioning staff about routine decisions, subtly implying that my oversight was reckless or unnecessary. She strategically questioned budgets, delayed approvals, and suggested alternative plans that seemed minor on the surface, but were intended to create confusion and frustration. Even my father, who had been increasingly supportive, began receiving subtle insinuations from her about his judgment and his willingness to align with me. Evelyn's attacks were no longer abstract. They were tangible, calculated to isolate me, make me doubt myself, and erode the support I had painstakingly built among the ranch employees. I realized I needed to respond with more than just patience. I needed strategy. Each action she took had to be countered with documentation, witness corroboration, or a legal safeguard. I began keeping a daily log of interactions, noting times, conversations, and her attempts to manipulate or intimidate. The ranch staff were briefed discreetly on what to observe and report, and neighbors who had previously provided casual accounts were now asked to formally document their observations. My lawyer emphasized maintaining meticulous records, advising me that in a confrontation like this, even minor inconsistencies in her narrative could become critical leverage. Every word, gesture, and action mattered, and I couldn't allow fear or hesitation to compromise the integrity of my case.
Evelyn escalated further when she began trying to sway community perception. She sent letters to longtime suppliers and contractors, insinuating that I was attempting to seize control irresponsibly, that my decisions would disrupt the operation and harm the ranch's legacy. She even attempted to pressure my father's friends, those who had known Grandpa Henry, suggesting that he should intervene on her behalf. Each move was calculated, designed to create a web of doubt and hesitation around me, and I realized that her opposition was no longer just personal. It had become a campaign to discredit my authority publicly. The mounting pressure weighed heavily, both emotionally and mentally, as I navigated this labyrinth of threats and attempts to undermine my credibility. One morning, the confrontation reached its peak. I had gathered the ranch employees in the main office for a routine briefing, discussing schedules, equipment maintenance, and livestock health, when Evelyn entered abruptly. She carried a folder of documents, her expression tight and controlled, but her eyes betrayed a hint of panic. "Madison," she began, her voice firm, "I've been reviewing your plans, and I'm concerned. Some of these actions are reckless, and I think the community and your father deserve to know exactly what you're doing before any irreversible decisions are made. Her words were carefully chosen to sound rational and protective, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. She intended to challenge me publicly, to assert her control, and to intimidate both me and the staff. I remained calm, speaking deliberately and presenting evidence of her unauthorized actions and manipulations. I referenced the documents, photographs, and witness statements we had collected, framing the discussion around facts rather than emotion. Every time she attempted to interject or shift blame, I countered with precision, showing the discrepancies in her claims, the timeline of unauthorized actions, and the legal validation of my ownership. I could see her frustration mounting as her attempts to dominate the conversation failed repeatedly. The ranch employees, once hesitant to speak, began affirming my statements, offering testimony about specific incidents of her overreach. It was a tense, charged environment, a high-stakes confrontation where truth and deception were clashing openly, and I felt both the intensity of the moment and the growing power of the evidence I wielded. The confrontation didn't end there. Over the next week, Evelyn tried multiple tactics, sending letters of complaint to the county, attempting to rally contractors and suppliers, and quietly pressuring staff who had been cooperative. Each time, I met her efforts with documentation, legal counsel, and unwavering composure. I realized that her aggression was a direct response to the undeniable truth I had uncovered. She could no longer control the narrative, and the more she tried to fight back, the more apparent her deception became. It was exhausting, relentless, and psychologically taxing, but each confrontation also reinforced the importance of vigilance and preparedness. By the end of the week, Evelyn's efforts had started to backfire. Staff and neighbors were no longer hesitant. They saw through her intimidation tactics, recognizing that her actions were attempts to subvert both legal authority and the ranch's long-standing traditions. My father, too, began asserting his support more openly, siding with the evidence rather than remaining neutral out of fear of confrontation. I realized that the second pinch point, the mounting pressure and open confrontation with the antagonist, was both a challenge and an opportunity. It tested my resolution, my patience, and my ability to remain calm under intense scrutiny. But it also solidified my position, demonstrating that truth, supported by evidence and moral clarity, could withstand the most aggressive attempts at suppression. Standing in the office one evening, after a long day of negotiations, counterclaims, and witnessing Evelyn's escalating frustration, I understood the stakes fully. The battle was far from over, but the confrontation had shown me that I had the capability, strategy, and support to see it through. The antagonist had revealed her true nature, her manipulations and threats laid bare, and I had met them with preparation, courage, and unwavering adherence to the truth. The moment was both exhausting and empowering. The pressure was intense, yet the path forward had never been clearer. The truth had to prevail, and I was now ready for whatever final obstacles awaited. The dark night of the soul arrived not with a dramatic showdown, but with the quiet, insidious weight of consequences that began pressing down on me from every angle. After weeks of gathering evidence, confronting Evelyn, and asserting my claim to the ranch, I had expected some relief, perhaps even a sense of vindication. Instead, I found myself engulfed in backlash, a storm more psychologically taxing than any confrontation could have been. The ranch, once a sanctuary, felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the pasture was a reminder that the battle I had ignited had repercussions far beyond the legal documents in my possession. I had spoken the truth, exposed deception.
It began with the subtle alienation of staff. Even those who had initially supported me started to hesitate, glancing nervously when Evelyn entered the room, whispering among themselves about possible repercussions. Some began questioning my decisions, not out of doubt, but out of fear of being associated with someone challenging Evelyn's authority. Contractors delayed deliveries, citing concerns about family tension, and a few longtime employees requested transfers, unwilling to be caught in the middle of what they perceived as escalating conflict. The isolation hit hard. The sense that speaking truth sometimes meant standing alone, even when armed with undeniable evidence. I felt the loneliness acutely, the emotional toll intensifying as I realized that justice, while morally necessary, could be socially costly. Then came the threats. Evelyn's subtler manipulations evolved into direct intimidation. I received anonymous letters warning me of financial consequences, veiled threats about disrupting the ranch, and suggestions that my reputation could be damaged in the local community if I continued pressing my claims. One evening, I found a message on my voicemail, the voice disguised, warning me to reconsider my actions, to think about the consequences of pursuing the truth. Fear, that primal sense of vulnerability, surged through me. I had anticipated resistance, confrontation, and even attempts at denial, but the intensity and personal nature of these threats was unexpected. The knowledge that standing up for what was right could provoke aggression beyond legal maneuvering was a harsh, sobering reality. Even my father's support, though steadfast, was strained under the pressure. He remained caught between loyalty to the family unit and the recognition that Evelyn had overstepped boundaries in ways that could not be ignored. His silence in some conversations, his hesitation to act decisively in front of staff, left me feeling the weight of responsibility settle squarely on my shoulders. I realized, painfully, that the courage to continue had to come from within. External support, while valuable, could not shield me from the emotional and social consequences of confronting deception head-on. The burden of defending the ranch, upholding my grandfather's legacy, and asserting my rightful ownership was mine alone, and the gravity of that responsibility pressed heavily against me. The media, though local, became involved as well. A neighbor, concerned about the rumors spreading through the small Montana community, contacted a local newspaper. While I had hoped public awareness might bolster my position, it instead intensified scrutiny. Evelyn painted me as aggressive, reckless, and unreasonable, framing her narrative in subtle ways that caused hesitation among some of the staff and contractors. Every conversation I had, every decision I made, felt magnified under the community's gaze. The pressure was relentless, the sense of being watched constant, and I began to understand the psychological toll of speaking truth in a world where perception often outweighs fact. One particularly harrowing moment came late at night, when I was alone in the barn reviewing documents and photographs, trying to catalog every piece of evidence for court proceedings. I realized, in that solitary space, that the cost of this fight wasn't just the confrontation with Evelyn. It was the toll on my mental and emotional well-being. The loneliness, the scrutiny, the subtle betrayals and hesitation of others, and the persistent threats combined to create a weight that was almost suffocating. I questioned myself, wondering if standing for the truth was worth the isolation, the strain on family relationships, and the fear that seemed to linger in every shadow. Yet amidst the fear and uncertainty, a small flame of resolve persisted. I remembered Grandpa Henry, the lessons he had imparted about resilience, integrity, and courage. I thought of the hours spent learning the ranch, the countless nights watching him work tirelessly to preserve its legacy. The realization struck me that this, the lowest point, was a crucible, painful, exhausting, and terrifying, but necessary. Standing for truth would inevitably attract backlash, and it was the willingness to endure that storm that separated those who capitulate from those who achieve justice. By the end of that week, the full weight of the dark night of the soul was undeniable. Evelyn's threats, the hesitation of allies, the subtle social and professional isolation, and the constant scrutiny created a pressure cooker environment. My resolve was tested in ways I had not anticipated.
And yet, even in that despair, I found clarity. The consequences were real, the stakes high, but the truth, the proof, the moral rightness of my claim remained immutable. I understood that enduring this stage, facing the immediate fallout and personal cost, was essential to reaching the final push. The choice to speak had brought consequences, yes, but it had also set in motion the inevitable recognition of justice. That night, as I looked out over the ranch under a sky thick with stars, I made a silent vow. Fear, isolation, and pressure could not deter me. Evelyn's manipulation, the community's scrutiny, and the weight of expectation were challenges I would meet head-on. The dark night of the soul had tested me, threatened to break me, but it had also illuminated the path forward. Perseverance, unwavering adherence to truth, and courage in the face of backlash were the only way to secure justice and preserve Grandpa Henry's legacy. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. The lowest point, yes, but also the catalyst for the final push that would follow.
The final push arrived with a sense of inevitability, as though every late night, every meticulous document, and every confrontation had been building toward this single moment. The county courthouse was buzzing quietly with activity, a low hum of anticipation and procedural rhythm. Yet to me it felt monumental, the culmination of months of struggle and scrutiny. My father walked beside me, his hand on my shoulder, grounding me even as my pulse quickened. The witnesses, neighbors, and ranch staff who had supported my claim were gathered in the small courtroom, their presence both reassuring and powerful. Evelyn arrived last, her poised exterior a mask that barely concealed the tension behind her eyes. She carried a stack of papers, undoubtedly prepared to challenge every claim, but I had long ago accepted that evidence, clarity, and truth would outweigh her attempts at deception. The proceedings began formally, with the judge reviewing the case and setting the framework for testimony and evidence presentation. I felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on me, the culmination of every painstaking hour of work, every late-night cataloging documents, every witness interview now distilled into the moments before the court. My lawyer, calm and focused, whispered final instructions, reminding me to stay composed, speak clearly, and let the evidence carry the weight of argument. I nodded, knowing that the weeks of preparation had led to this point. Every photograph, every document, every corroborated testimony had a purpose, to ensure that the truth could no longer be denied. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the bench deliberately, laying out the original deed, the unauthorized sale documents, the internal contract forged by Evelyn, and the detailed chronology of events. Each item was presented methodically, accompanied by witness testimonies and supporting evidence. I spoke steadily, recounting the unauthorized decisions, the subtle manipulations, and the deliberate attempts to isolate and discredit me. Evelyn attempted to interject, claiming misinterpretations or misunderstandings, but each assertion was met with factual counterpoints and documented proof. I realized then that the preparation, patience, and discipline I had cultivated over months had transformed me. The fear that had once gnawed at me was replaced by a calm certainty, a resolute belief that the truth would prevail. The witnesses were called one by one, their statements reinforcing the narrative I had laid out. The longtime ranch hands spoke of unauthorized orders and manipulations, the neighbors corroborated my observations of irregular activity, and the county official verified the authenticity of the original deed and other key documents. Each testimony layered upon the next, creating a seamless narrative that highlighted both the moral and legal validity of my claim. I watched Evelyn's expression shift from confident deflection to visible frustration, her attempts at control unraveling as the objective reality of her actions was exposed. It was a tense, almost cinematic sequence, the courtroom charged with the energy of confrontation and revelation. At a pivotal moment, my lawyer requested that the forged internal contract be entered into evidence formally. The judge examined it carefully, the signatures and inconsistencies glaringly obvious. The document, which Evelyn had believed would give her leverage, instead solidified the case against her. The room fell into a brief silence,
the weight of undeniable proof settling over everyone present. Evelyn attempted to defend herself verbally, but her words lacked the credibility, coherence, and documentation required to counter the overwhelming body of evidence. For the first time, her confidence wavered openly, and it became clear that the narrative she had tried to control for months was no longer hers to shape. As the hearing progressed, I realized the final push was as much about moral victory as legal success. The truth was no longer abstract. It had been observed, documented, and validated in a public, authoritarian forum. Every attempt to deception, every subtle manipulation, had been met with meticulous evidence and corroboration. I felt a sense of empowerment that was profound, almost liberating. The culmination of months of effort, persistence, and courage had created a moment in which truth could not be ignored. I knew that the court's acknowledgement of evidence was not merely a procedural necessity, but a public validation of the moral righteousness of my claim. By the afternoon, the judge had reviewed all evidence, heard testimonies, and allowed final statements. Evelyn's attempts at manipulation were systematically dismantled. Each claim she made was countered with factual evidence, witness statements, and documentation. My final address summarized the timeline, the unauthorized actions, and the intent behind them, emphasizing not only the legality of my claim, but also the moral imperative of protecting the legacy my grandfather had entrusted to me. The courtroom was silent, the focus intense, as the evidence and truth stood indisputable. The weight of months of preparation and confrontation seemed to converge into this singular moment where justice and integrity met. When the judge finally ruled in favor of my claim, recognizing the legality of the original deed and invalidating Evelyn's unauthorized sale, a wave of relief and vindication washed over me. The staff, neighbors, and witnesses who had supported me nodded quietly, the tension in the room easing. Evelyn sat, expressions stilled, her defeat palpable but unspoken. My father's hand found mine, squeezing it firmly, a gesture of pride, support, and shared relief. The final push, the climax, where the truth had been presented, examined, and validated, had arrived, leaving no room for doubt. As I stepped outside the courthouse into the warm afternoon sun, I felt the enormity of the moment. The fight, the confrontation, the months of preparation, and the personal cost had culminated in victory. The ranch, my grandfather's legacy, and my rightful claim were secure, and the truth had prevailed. For the first time, I could breathe freely, knowing that courage, persistence, and adherence to principle had transformed a long, exhausting struggle into tangible justice. With the courthouse behind me and the legal battle finally settled, I returned to the ranch with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet triumph. The tension that had pervaded the property for months had not evaporated instantly, but there was a sense of equilibrium, a reassertion of order now that the truth had been publicly recognized. Staff returned to their routines with renewed confidence, neighbors approached with supportive words, and my father, though still processing the emotional weight of Evelyn's betrayal, was steadier and more present. The vindication was not just legal, it was deeply personal, a validation of the months I had spent meticulously gathering evidence, confronting deception, and asserting my rightful claim. The ranch, once shadowed by uncertainty and manipulation, was returning to its rightful state. The first days after the ruling were both busy and reflective. I walked the fields that my grandfather had once roamed, taking in the sweeping vistas of Montana's rolling plains and the barns and fences that had stood for decades. Each structure, each acre felt reclaimed, not just legally, but morally and spiritually. Staff members who had been hesitant or fearful over the past months approached me individually, offering quiet thanks, recounting the anxiety they had endured, and expressing relief that the truth had prevailed. Their gratitude was humbling, a reminder that my fight had been about more than personal vindication. It had been about protecting a community, a livelihood, and the legacy of someone who had worked tirelessly to preserve it. Evelyn, predictably, did not leave quietly, but her options were limited. The court's ruling had invalidated her sale and recognized my legal ownership, and any further attempts at deception would now be met with swift legal consequences. She tried a few feeble gestures of reconciliation, but they were half-hearted, lacking sincerity, and transparently motivated by self-interest. I engaged minimally, maintaining firm boundaries, aware that her attempts at manipulation could still create unnecessary friction. The lesson was clear. Justice does not require forgiveness, only integrity in action. I had stood for truth, and the recognition of that truth did not obligate me to excuse or tolerate further misconduct. In the days that followed, my father and I worked together to restore normalcy. Decisions about the ranch's operations, previously overshadowed by uncertainty, were now made collaboratively and transparently. We evaluated contracts, reviewed equipment needs, and organized staff schedules with clear communication and mutual trust. The atmosphere, once tense and strained, became productive and positive. I could feel the morale of the team shift, the sense of security and fairness returning. The validation of my claim had ripple effects that extended beyond legality. It restored confidence, respect, and clarity throughout the ranch community. Emotionally, the process of vindication was profound. I reflected on the months of struggle, the painstaking collection of evidence, the confrontations, the isolation, and the moments of self-doubt. Each trial had been arduous, but each had reinforced my understanding of resilience, patience, and moral courage. Standing up for truth, even when the path is fraught with fear, opposition, and uncertainty, is a transformative experience. The legal recognition of my ownership of the ranch was the tangible outcome, but the deeper victory was internal, the affirmation that integrity, diligence, and courage are powerful forces capable of overcoming deceit, manipulation, and intimidation. I also felt a renewed connection to my grandfather, whose legacy had been the catalyst for this journey. Walking through the barns, examining the fences, and overseeing livestock care, I could hear his voice in memory, lessons about perseverance, attention to detail, and the importance of protecting what one values most. The vindication was a fulfillment of his trust, a demonstration that his legacy was preserved not only in material terms, but also through the values he had instilled. Each step across the ranch now carried a deeper meaning. Every decision made in his name was both a responsibility and a tribute. The community's response was equally heartening. Neighbors, friends, and local business owners expressed support and admiration, acknowledging the perseverance and courage it had taken to confront deception and assert rightful ownership. Their recognition reinforced the sense that truth has a broader impact beyond immediate legal or personal outcomes. It creates trust, restores order, and inspires others who may face similar challenges. Knowing that the example I set could influence others gave a profound sense of purpose and reinforced the long-term importance of the stand I had taken.
Reflecting on the journey, I realized that the resolution wasn't just an endpoint. It was the foundation for a new equilibrium. I had reclaimed authority, preserved my grandfather's legacy, and reaffirmed the principles of justice, integrity, and courage. The experience, though grueling, had strengthened my sense of self, clarified my priorities, and underscored the importance of standing firm in the face of opposition. I understood that this equilibrium was not static. It required ongoing vigilance, ethical leadership, and the commitment to uphold the standards I had fought to restore. By the time evening fell, the ranch settled into a peaceful quiet, the Montana horizon ablaze with the last rays of sunlight. I stood on the porch, looking over the property, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and calm. Justice had prevailed. The staff, the neighbors, and my father recognized the truth. And most importantly, I had proven to myself that courage and integrity, when paired with persistence and careful action, could overcome even the most determined deception. The equilibrium had been restored, and the ranch and its legacy were safe in my hands.
The final image of this chapter of my life was not a dramatic confrontation or a courtroom victory, but the quiet, profound transformation that came from reclaiming both the ranch and my sense of purpose. Weeks after the legal battles had ended, the Montana plains stretched before me under the golden light of early morning, the horizon blending into soft shades of pink and orange. I walked along the fence line, feeling the coarse texture of the wood under my hands, the scent of hay and earth heavy in the air, and the soft lowing of cattle in the distance. Everything felt different, not because the land had changed, but because I had changed. The fear, doubt, and anxiety that had once dominated my days were replaced with calm determination, a steady sense of ownership and responsibility that was both exhilarating and grounding. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was visible in every aspect of ranch life. The staff moved confidently, following schedules and plans we had collaboratively rebuilt, their trust in my leadership reaffirmed after months of tension and uncertainty. Repairs and improvements that had been delayed due to Evelyn's interference were finally underway. Barns repainted, fences reinforced, and irrigation systems repaired. Every decision I made was purposeful, guided by lessons learned from the confrontation and reinforced by the knowledge that protecting the ranch required vigilance, foresight, and ethical leadership. For the first time, I felt fully in control, not in a domineering sense, but with a clarity of authority grounded in justice and integrity. My relationship with my father had evolved as well. The fear and hesitation that had once limited his engagement were replaced with mutual respect and shared purpose. We discussed plans for the upcoming seasons, strategies for livestock management, and even potential expansions of the ranch. He asked questions, offered advice, and most importantly, trusted my judgment. There was a harmony in our collaboration, a restoration of family bonds that had been strained by months of deception, uncertainty, and conflict. This reconciliation, built on honesty and mutual respect, felt like one of the most important victories of all, the emotional closure that accompanied the legal and operational triumphs. Evelyn's presence in our lives had diminished naturally. The legal ruling had neutralized her ability to interfere, and her attempts at reconciliation or subtle influence were met with polite, firm boundaries. I had learned through this arduous process that empowerment wasn't about confrontation alone. It was about setting clear limits, asserting authority ethically, and not allowing past transgressions to dictate present decisions. Every interaction with her became a test of composure and principle, and each successful navigation reinforced my confidence and autonomy. I no longer feared her manipulations or threats. The power of truth, action, and integrity had established an unassailable foundation. Beyond the immediate restoration of the ranch and family dynamics, I began contemplating the future, not just in terms of property, but legacy and purpose. I considered ways to honor Grandpa Henry's contributions, from establishing mentorship programs for local youth interested in agriculture to hosting community events that celebrated Montana's ranching heritage. The experience had taught me that standing up for truth is not only about defending personal rights, but also about creating a broader impact, ensuring that lessons learned and values upheld extend beyond immediate circumstances. The ranch had become a symbol of resilience, integrity, and empowerment, not just a piece of property, but a living testament to the power of courage and persistence. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch with my grandfather's old notebook in hand, I reflected on the journey, the initial shock of discovery, the months of evidence gathering, the confrontations, the threats, and the relentless pressure of exposing Evelyn's deception. Each challenge had tested me in ways I had not anticipated, pushing me to confront fear, isolation, and self-doubt. But each trial had also reinforced the truth that courage, patience, and integrity, when combined with deliberate action, could overcome even the most determined deception. I felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended legal victory. It was an internal validation of strength, resilience, and moral clarity that I knew would guide me for the rest of my life.
The staff joined me for a quiet celebration that evening, a small gathering at the edge of the pastures with the setting sun casting long, warm shadows across the fields. There were smiles, laughter, and conversations filled with gratitude and relief. They spoke not just of the legal victory, but of the restoration of fairness, trust, and clarity within the ranch community. I realized then that the impact of standing up for truth radiates outward, touching the lives of others, fostering confidence, and reinforcing communal bonds. The transformation was complete, both in the physical environment of the ranch and in the collective spirit of those who lived and worked there. As night fell, I stood alone for a moment, gazing at the stars scattered across Montana's vast sky. I reflected on the entire journey, the hardships, the confrontations, the moral dilemmas, and the final triumph. I felt an enduring sense of empowerment, a deep connection to my grandfather's legacy, and a renewed sense of purpose. I understood that this experience had prepared me not only to manage the ranch effectively, but to face future challenges with confidence and moral clarity. The transformation was total, from doubt and fear to confidence and resolve, from uncertainty to a clear, purposeful path forward. In that quiet, starlit moment, I recognized that the ranch was more than land. It was a testament to perseverance, integrity, and courage. I have not only reclaimed property and legacy, but I had discovered the strength to confront injustice, protect what mattered most, and emerge transformed. The journey had been arduous, but the reward, a new life of purpose, empowerment, and hope, was undeniable. I felt ready to carry forward the lessons learned, to honor Grandpa Henry's memory, and to use the experience to guide others who might one day face similar trials. The final image of this chapter was clear: a ranch restored, a family reconciled, and a young woman empowered, standing firmly in her truth, ready to shape the future with courage and integrity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.